Hello, and welcome to Bank on Emissions, the hidden impact of where you keep your money. We are delighted to welcome you today. I'm Melanie Windle, Executive Director of the Sustainable Entertainment Society. I am tuning in from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and Métis Nation Region 3. In the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. Please use the chat function and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you're not sure, check out native-land.ca. As allies in the ongoing battle against climate change, we stand united, determined to preserve and protect the land, to be stewards of its natural gifts, and to facilitate healing. This commitment echoes the enduring spirit of the Indigenous peoples who have safeguarded this land for countless generations. Housekeeping. So we are saving time at the end for a robust Q&A, so please drop your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end. Also, please tag us at #SustainableProductionForum if you choose to share anything on social media. So it's my pleasure to be joined in a few moments by Dan Sherrard-Smith, founder MotherTree, and José Luis Gutiérrez, sustainable motion picture producer, Motoca Specific Gear. So we're very, very excited about that. We'll also be throwing some questions in the chat, so please feel free to answer them. Let us know your thoughts. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan. Welcome.
Thank you, Melanie. It's really great to be here. Really looking forward to this chat. And as Melanie says, do put questions in the chat. We'd love to see them as we go. So I've got about 20-25 minutes of content really unpacking the hidden impact of the banks in Canada and beyond. And then I'm really excited we'll then head into a Q&A with José Luis. Very excited for that as well. But without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here and bring up the presentation. Great. Okay, here we go. So firstly, a bit of housekeeping. Do try and keep your cameras on. It just makes for a more engaging session. And please do stay on mute. It means others can hear. But the chat function's there, so pop your questions or your observations in chat. I'll be checking it as best I can as we go. And we've got lots of time for Q&A at the end, as Melanie has said. In terms of MotherTree's mission, so we make it easy for values-led businesses to go green and save money. We focus on 6 key areas. So it's current accounts, savings accounts, pensions, investments, insurance, and energy. And in the last 2.5 years, we've explored over 40 different actions businesses across the world can take to reduce their carbon footprint. We've conducted over 350 hours of interviews with scientists, with CEOs, with finance directors to really understand the impact of climate change on their businesses. And we've calculated thousands of footprints. And we've realized that there are just 2 actions above all others that have a significant impact on our carbon emissions, on the level of biodiversity, on the size of the gender pay gap, and many other areas that go into creating a healthy, vibrant society. And we're going to unpack one of those actions on this call. Just by making sure your bank and pension are invested ethically, you can dramatically cut your businesses or your personal carbon footprint. You can get money into places that you want to see thrive over the next 10 years without necessarily giving up returns or security. And we're going to focus on banking on this call. So we're going to unpack this, how all of that fits together over the next 40 minutes or so. In terms of MotherTree and how it got its name, I think this is particularly relevant given we're talking to a Canadian audience. You can probably tell by my accent that I'm from the UK, from the other side of the pond, from Wales. But MotherTree is actually inspired by a Canadian scientist called Susan Simard. She wrote the book called Finding the Mother Tree. She discovered that trees in old growth forests share nutrients through the mycelium, which is kind of like the roots of the mushrooms. And the trees that share the most, that knit the forests the most in terms of the connections that they have, are the mother trees. And that's what MotherTree, the business, aims to be about. It's about creating an ecosystem of sustainably minded people and businesses where we can all thrive. In terms of the journey so far, so we launched in March 2022. We've evaluated and represent over £290 million on behalf of our clients. We found routes to reduce over 26,000 tons of carbon, so on track to reduce that. And we've saved clients over 500 hours of work. The leadership team, so there's three of us. That's me on the left with my boy Theo, a little bit about him a little later on. Julia in the middle. Julia is our, she covers all things design and behavior science. Julia has a really diverse background. She's worked for FTSE 250 companies. She's worked for the UK's first energy unicorn to hit £1 billion valuation. She's also worked with artists like Eminem and Elton John. And Craig Wellington on the right, well, he's our Chief Operating Officer. He's an award-winning accountant. And Craig has 10 plus years experience at high-level consultancy firms like Bain & Co. So a bit about me. I was on the founding team of a business called Look After My Bills, which had the best ever deal on Dragon's Den. I think it's also called Dragon's Den in Canada. It might be Shark Tank over there. And we saved the British public £127 million over 3 years through switching energy for almost 1 million UK households. And it was while working at Look After My Bills that my wife became pregnant. We've now got a 3-year-old son called Theo. We need to update that photo. It's very dated now. But while my wife was pregnant, it really made me question where I was spending my time and what the world was going to be like when this child, we didn't know it was a boy and he'd be called Theo. We just knew it was, my wife was pregnant. We knew we were going to have a child. What this world was going to be like for this child when they're in their mid-30s, when they're my age. And it was a real wake-up call for me. I'd like to just take us back a few years to where I grew up. I grew up in Swansea, South Wales. It's on the edge of a beautiful part of the UK called the Gower, which is on the coast, beautiful Jurassic cliffs and golden sand and freezing cold water, which tends to keep the tourists away. But I fell in love with that place. And I remember at 12 years old, sitting in a geography class and hearing about climate change for the first time and realizing without dramatic change, we were going to lose this beautiful part of the world within my lifetime. And I didn't know what to do about that thought. But when my wife was pregnant and I started thinking about what the future is going to be, it was like these two thoughts collided and I quit my comfortable job at Look After My Bills. And I started researching what has become MotherTree. First, I started listening to all sorts of people, mums and dads and CEOs and people in their 20s just starting their career to understand how climate change impacts or doesn't impact their lifestyles. And then we ran a series of essentially focus groups, but we called it the Climate Challenge, which were groups of 8 people at a time, but enough to share a pizza, hopefully a vegan pizza, taking on different challenges to live sustainably. We took 30 challenges over 30 days and we ran this for 5 groups. We did all sorts of challenges. We looked at our carbon footprint. We went vegan for the day. We got rid of single-use plastic. But the thing that stood out the most shocking impact was when we realized where our banks were investing and where our pensions were invested, me included. The first climate challenge I went on, I realized 2% of my pension was in BP and Shell. 1% was in British American tobacco. 1% was in weapons. There was money in gambling, just things that I'd never choose to invest in. And yet every month, some of my cash had been going there. And at the same time, I looked at Look After My Bills bank account, and Look After My Bills were banking with a bank called Lloyds here in the UK. Lloyds have put over £1 billion a year into fossil fuels. So just by holding an account with them, we were contributing to that strategy. And that's where we focused a huge amount of time at MotherTree. That's where we launched the business. We started researching what that meant in terms of carbon footprints for businesses, and the results were shocking. We found that for most businesses, the biggest source of emissions is from where they keep their cash. And this applies globally. We're going to unpack a few global examples later on. And it's because of where your bank is lending money. Now, we looked at Canada's Big Five. In 2022, they invested 183 billion Canadian dollars into oil and gas. So these are the traditional Big Five in Canada: TD, RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC. Well, they've invested $183 billion in just 1 year into oil and gas. And it gets a bit worse. Since 2016, those 5 banks have invested over 1,000 billion Canadian dollars into fossil fuels. It makes Canadian banks the 3rd biggest funder of fossil fuel projects after the US and Chinese banks. And the global banks, so the world's 60 biggest banks, which includes the 5 Canadian banks, have put 50 times more into fossil fuel expansion than the fossil fuel companies themselves. To put that another way, for every pound that BP and Shell put towards fossil fuel expansion, so expanding their fossil fuel extraction activities, the banks put 50 pounds. In short, money is the oxygen that keeps fossil fuel burning. And this has an impact on the overall carbon emissions of a company or of a movie studio or of the movie industry in general. We looked at Google and parent company Alphabet. Google keep 130 billion US dollars in their bank accounts. And based on how those banks are investing, that money has a carbon footprint. And in fact, that carbon footprint is twice as big as all the other actions for Google and Alphabet and their supply chain combined. So Google are really robust with their reporting of their emissions, but when you include the cash, it's 2 times bigger on their reported emissions. And this trend stacks up for so many big businesses that we looked at. We looked at Netflix, we looked at Amazon, we looked at Disney. The biggest emissions for these companies is where they keep their cash. In fact, for Apple, when you include their cash, it's 3.9 times higher than their reported emissions. And I don't know about you, there was a brilliant video of Tim Cook meeting Mother Earth, Mother Nature in the boardroom at Apple. And they go through all the great things that Apple's doing for sustainability, but they didn't mention their cash. It's the elephant in the room. They didn't mention the biggest impact on their emissions. And for a business like PayPal, who move money from A to B, I don't know if you have PayPal in Canada, hopefully, so this example rings true, but essentially they're a service that move money from A to B. They're not a bank. When you include the cash from their emissions, it's 57 times higher than their reported emissions. So how does this impact a typical Canadian company? Because these were the companies we were looking at on this page. These are companies with huge cash reserves for paying thousands of employees, for acquiring other companies, for rainy days. Well, how does the trend line up for a typical Canadian company? Well, a typical Canadian company has about there's 1.2 million businesses in Canada, and the average business has 10 employees. And looking at their scope 1, 2, and 3, which is their own activities plus their supply chain, it contributes about 131 tons per year. That's the average Canadian business. And when you add in their bank, it adds another 171 tons. So it's more than double just that one action. Remember, all the other actions that this business does, 131 tons, the bank, 171 tons. And this is a company with 10 employees. It's not your colossal company like Google or Apple. So it has a really big impact. Quick case study. So Go Cardless, very similar to PayPal. They're a UK-based online payment platform. They process over £30 billion through their banks on behalf of their customers. Go Cardless partnered with MotherTree to assess the carbon footprint from their cash and develop strategies to reduce it. Go Cardless emissions grew by 30 times when they had the cash position included, but it gave them the true impact of their business, not just scope 1, 2, and 3, not just the cars that they drive, that's important, but crucially their cash. And what we're now doing with Go Cardless is we're working to move billions of pounds, which is I think more in Canadian dollars, billions of pounds out of fossil fuel investing banks and into banks that refuse to invest in fossil fuels. And we're going to unpack a bit of that later on in terms of the difference between those banks in Canada. So we've seen the carbon impact When we looked at the impact on wider values, the results were just as stark, because banks continue to invest in areas that simply don't align to our values. With TD, they had the biggest increase in fossil fuel financing worldwide last year of any bank. Canada, US, China, any bank. TD had the biggest increase in financing fossil fuels. I don't stand for that. Absolutely not. Bank of Montreal has been found to fund tar sands, oil, and fracking. It's destroying indigenous lands in terms of tar sands and fracking. It's causing people illness in terms of the water that they're getting from the use of the chemicals in fracking. Bank of Montreal are funding this. And RBC have been named in non-compliance with anti-money laundering and terrorist financing measures just last year. So these banks, not only is it fossil fuels, but they're undermining the things that we take for granted as a society. It will get better. I promise you there's good news to come, but we've got to see the reality of the situation. Here's a quick case study. QuickFox Labs. This is one of my favorite clients. Probably shouldn't say our favorite clients, but these just a brilliant business. They're called QuickFox Labs, run by two female founders, Emma and Amy. Emma and Amy, they started this business in their 30s. They had long careers before that, and neither of them ever had a female boss, which is just ludicrous. And they recruit out of prisons and out of foster care. So their whole business is about social mobility. It's about equality and diversity. Yet when we looked at their bank was investing billions into all-white male boards and all-white male C-suites. It was undermining the work that Emma and Amy do. So we switched their bank, we saved the money, we reduced the carbon. But the thing that Emma and Amy, the founders, got most value out of is that they now know their bank is investing proportionally more into diverse boards, diverse leadership teams, and into prison systems that allow for the successful reintegration of citizens. So it's really supporting their goals and their mission. Now, 50% of CEOs are worried about the impact of climate change on their business in the next 12 months. I am wondering what the other 50% are worried about if they're not including climate change on that list. They absolutely should be. But this represents a really big opportunity for sustainable leaders, for sustainability leaders. Here's 3 examples of companies living their values. Right Charge, their mission is to electrify everything. They work with EV fleets and vehicles to change businesses' fleets into EVs and clean vehicles. Every time they swap a diesel car out for an EV, they're pushing their mission to electrify everything. Climate Change Coach is a wonderful business, happily a client of MotherTree's, and their mission is to inspire and lead action that counts. They work with people to move from climate anxiety into genuine action. And Patagonia, who I think it was last year, maybe a year and a half ago, announced that all of the company profits will go to saving the planet. I mean, what an incredible thing to do. It's also just an incredible sales tactic. And a lot of people started buying Patagonia after that, buying Patagonia clothes. These companies, certainly Climate Change Coaches, before working with MotherTree, the biggest footprint, even for Patagonia, was their bank. And yet we were able to reduce, for Climate Change Coaches in particular, 90% of their footprint just by making sure the bank and the pension were in the right places. Here's the good news. What if doing the right thing when it came to finances, so our banks, pensions, insurance, and so on, also meant higher revenue and more investment? Well, we've uncovered that it pays to go green. You get less returns in general from the providers who invest most heavily in fossil fuels. So here's the good news. We looked at earlier this year when we were setting up for this presentation, and the trend will remain. We've tracked it every single month in the UK and abroad in terms of interest rates. The average Big Five, so for the Canadian banks, we looked at the interest rates they're offering as an average. So that's banks like RBC and Bank of Montreal. And then we looked at the green alternative banks like Van City to get an understanding of how does their interest rate compare. And guess what? It pays to go green. The greener banks are offering better interest rates. It's on instant access business accounts, but it applies to individuals as well. You get less money from the banks that are investing more into fossil fuels. I just think that's absolutely outrageous. And the solution, it's so switch, right? And as a consumer, it's a little bit easier, but for a business, it's not that easy. You know, businesses aren't switching. It's busy just to run a business, let alone look at the bank. It takes a lot of time. It takes about 50 hours to put in the research to really understand what are the business requirements, what are the options out there, and is the new bank really going to fit the requirements? Is the funding going to be there for the next film, for the next documentary? You have to make sure, making sure that the security of money is absolutely on point, and also avoiding the accidental greenwash. It could switch bank, but if the new bank is also investing in fossil fuels, well, that hasn't helped. It's hard to access the best interest rates, so we negotiate directly with banks on behalf of our clients to secure them the best interest rates. There's a risk of impacting business process when the switch is done incorrectly. It could impact the financing for a film. And there's confusion. We put pension in, but also banking confusion, just confusion around where these banks are investing. And what are their processes? Are they going to match the processes for the existing business? But most of all, we find this is the reason that people don't switch bank. I certainly feel like this lady at times. Perhaps you do. She's got an almost endless in tray. For me, it's an inbox, but it just seems an endless list. And switching banks very rarely, if ever, gets to the top of it. I really hear you on that point. That's why we set up MotherTree. We focus on 6 key actions: current account, savings accounts, pensions, investments, insurance, and energy. We do the work, so you get the benefits. It means happier clients, because it's a proof point. It shows that you are able to walk the walk when it comes to sustainability, which means more revenue into the business, happier, more productive employees. Again, because you're able to walk the walk, which means less money spent on recruitment and retention, and more aligned investors that really get that this is a company that takes sustainability seriously and is taking genuine action. And we've unlocked for several of our clients increased investment as a result of these changes. What we aim to give every single client is clarity, confidence, and control. Because ultimately, if you haven't got clarity around your finances, it will erode your confidence in what it can do. And that means somebody else is likely to have control of it. Well, we aim to flip the switch on that. And we do that through our MPS method. That's measure, prioritize, switch. First up, we measure where the organization currently is. We look at business requirements. So does it work with the accounting software? Is it going to work with the funding that's coming in for the next film production? We look at carbon footprint, we look at financial impact, and we look at broader values, things like biodiversity and diversity. Once we have a really clear view of where the business currently is, we're able to prioritize. We look at all of market, completely independent. We don't take any commission. Where are there banks out there that are going to fit this business's needs, are going to save the business money, are going to reduce the carbon, and also align with the values, like for Emma and Amy at Quick Fox Labs. And then once you're happy with the plan, we get to work supporting you on the switch, making sure everything goes smoothly. We're backed by experts. So we're backed by Professor Mike Berners-Lee and his consultancy, Small World Consulting. Mike Berners-Lee wrote the book, How Bad Are Bananas? The byline is the carbon footprint of everything. He's one of the authorities worldwide on carbon footprinting, and his carbon footprint data underpins a lot of what we do. And the impact for a typical Canadian business, so that typical Canadian business that we saw, 10 employees, were able to shift 680,000 Canadian dollars into the green economy. We save 75 tons of carbon, often it's more than that, and we save 11,100 Canadian dollars per year. For our latest clients, a UK client, but I've exchanged the money from pounds to Canadian dollars. We saved them 50,000 Canadian dollars, not US. We saved them 50,000 Canadian dollars last year just by making the switches, and we saved them 450 tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of the carbon absorbed by a small forest every single year. So thank you so much for listening. If you want to maximize your company's impact and find out the impact of your business finances, you can head to mymothertree.com/business. I'm sure Melanie and TJ will pop that in there in the chat in terms of a link, and looking forward to moving to Q&A with Jose Luis. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Jose Luis.
Thank you very much for your time. And it's fantastic to hear about solutions in the banking and financing world. My first question or comment question is, Vancity is an excellent provincial bank. But considering the multi-currency global banking needs required to create movies, features, documentaries, and TV series that play worldwide, and produce large cruise, ground, and air travel pollution, how can filmmakers make their finances work for their projects and the planet?
It's a great question, Jose Luis, and a really important one for filmmakers to pose because it's busy business. They're flying around the world, making these films, making these documentaries. Well, one of the simplest tasks that they can do is simply make sure that their bank is, aligned to their business needs so that they can film without worrying that the money's going to go missing. But crucially, that bank also supports their values and can reduce the carbon footprint. As you said, there are banks in Canada. I was going to say in the UK. There are banks in Canada that already support that, and worldwide there are options out there. So it's not for lack of options. My thinking is it's lack of awareness and lack of time, but we can change that. Those are two things that each of us hold in our grasp to make a difference on.
And you would be able to help these filmmakers, MotherTree will be able to help these filmmakers identify and make the switch to banks that are greener in general. Can you talk about banks that are generally greener, Canadian banks?
Yeah, so there's Vancity you already mentioned. It's a great bank that's doing some really impressive things here. But there's a whole swathe. And obviously, with Canada, it's very much kind of in the state side as well. So just making sure that it works for the specific state. I can see we've got someone from Alberta on the call, so it has to work for that person in Alberta. So it is about doing the research at the right level for the business. Is it a global business that needs to access cash when they're filming in the US and Europe and so forth? Well, that is a very different setup to, say, a business that's located in Alberta and stays in Alberta in terms of the business it does. So it is about the research and really understanding the values as well. We saw Emma and Amy as an example. For them, making sure the diversity aspect was front and center was really the key. And that will change in terms of our bank's strategies. So it might be that, you take a kind of hit on reducing carbon, but make sure you're really maximizing increasing diversity. And what we do is we look at that granular level. What are the options? Let's look with our eyes open. Is it going to be a compromise on carbon, on values, on saving money? Happily, often it's not a compromise at all, but it is important to look with eyes open.
Absolutely. Now, this last year, there was an open letter to TIFF to drop RBC as a sponsor. The argument is that some of the people who signed the letter, some of the celebrities who signed the letter, have or travel in private jets and super yachts. What is the banking footprint equivalent of stars using fossil fuel-based transportation compared to financial institutions investing in the fossil fuel economy?
It's a really important question to grapple with, and it harks to this sense of the 1% of the planet, of the population, are causing the most damage, and that is unfortunately true. And stars can send a really important message by reducing their private air travel and getting off the super yacht. But I get, they have a certain lifestyle that they perhaps want to maintain, and changing the bank, even for people with those kind of lifestyles, can often be the biggest single change. Just in the UK, the average, just to bring it back to feet on the ground, the average UK citizen's footprint is about 10 tons of carbon. That's based on what they eat and how they travel. Well, when you add in their bank and their pension, it adds another 10 tons. So just those two things double the average UK citizens. The more money you hold, the more that part of the pie increases. So even for someone like Taylor Swift, who does get a lot of flack for flying, And I think rightly so at times. Like I get, even Taylor Swift can be reducing flights, but her bank balance will be contribute almost half, if not more, than her entire footprint. So it makes a huge difference.
So if Taylor Swift is listening and or Leonardo DiCaprio is listening, please not only switch your banks, but also invest heavily in the electrification of your super yachts and private jets. Maybe that'll help.
That will certainly help. I just want to say that letter was such an inspiration. Thank you so much for you and the others who were involved in the letter to Tiff. I think that is also a really crucial part of the action that each of us can play is not only changing bank or reducing flights, it's also making sure we're telling the people like Tiff, organizations like Tiff, actually there are other ways to do this, and we will back you to make those changes.
Thank you. Maggie is asking, I spent some time learning about brown investing versus green. The general idea being that investing in a green company won't make it more green, but investing in a brown company that is putting effort into going green can be better in the long run. Your money will see more return in CO2 saved, good done. Because this brown company simply has more room to do better and puts more funds towards being green. Do you agree, disagree with this? Does it really matter when it comes down to where the money lives?
So this harks to quite a few key points. So maybe it's worth just us breaking it out into its constituent parts. But Maggie, fantastic question. The first bit I'm hearing is about divestment. Is it better to stay with a company that invests in fossil fuels but lobby them to change, or is it better to take that money out and invest it in renewable energy? Divestment. The argument of divestment is if you take that money out and put it in renewable energy, what you're doing is you're actually moving the stock price down ever so slightly, and someone else with less scrupulous morals, the new Maggie, will come in and buy that stock, and they won't lobby the fossil fuel company to change. Now, at kind of an individual level, at my level, divestment doesn't work. It's often better to keep the money in and lobby for change. But when we're talking about the level of billions of pounds, of billions of Canadian dollars, just looking at those 5 Canadian banks, I think it was 1,000 billion Canadian dollars over the last 6 years into fossil fuels. That is an amount that the fossil fuel companies cannot replace. That is when divestment starts to work. And if we get enough banks moving that cash out, it will move, as Bill McKibben said, the oxygen out of fossil fuel companies. So that's the divestment bit, Maggie. I think it's a really important point to make. The second point is about, what I'm hearing is about growth. Is about, do I get more money by putting my cash into browner stocks versus greener stocks? We've done a lot of research on this over the past 3 years, and we've looked back over the past 10 years. Now, a couple of examples. The first is when we looked at green pension funds, and we verified that they were genuinely green. There was no fossil fuels sneaking in there on the G of ESG. If you heard of ESG, environmental, social governance, it's a proxy for greener stocks. It doesn't always mean that. But we verified that they were green funds, and we tracked those green funds against the default funds for pension providers. And the default fund, if you're an employee, you have a pension, it's likely you're in a default fund. Or the greener funds performed about 15% better over the last 5 years. So it's actually possible with the right research to get better returns on greener funds. This isn't financial advice. This is a historical view of the market. So there is a kind of returns piece. It has to match with your risk profile. But Maggie, in terms of getting returns, browner companies versus green, we're seeing better returns of green when it's done right. The second example I'd like to just touch on is when we looked at the S&P 500, and hypothetically we said we put £10 in the S&P 500 over the last 10 years, and then we'll put £10 in the fossil fuel companies that are within the S&P 500, right? So it's the same companies. The S&P 500 performed better in terms of that £10 than the fossil fuel companies. What that means is the fossil fuel companies are actually bringing the S&P 500 stock down. It's worse for your money. We don't hear that message very often. But when you look at the data, when you look at the graphs, even with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the spike in price of oil, even with that, it's still a drain on the S&P 500 in terms of returns. So Maggie, I hope that's answered your question. There was a lot in that question. So if I missed a part, Jose, Luis, or Maggie, do let me know.
Well, I want to follow up with these large companies that are part of the 500. You mentioned Netflix and Apple. What is the equivalency in the motion picture sector from small, independent, and low-budget production companies all the way to large motion picture lobbying groups, associations, film festivals, and events in switching banks and divesting investing in green rather than divesting from dirty energy, investing in clean energy? What is the value on that to them, to the industry as a whole? You mentioned about the benefit to employees, but can you elaborate a little bit?
Yes, this is an absolutely fantastic question, Jose Luis, and I suspect you're just as well qualified, if not more qualified, to answer this one. So do jump in. But in terms of the wider impacts, and not just employees, we're seeing for festivals a huge spike in positive sentiment for genuine leaders in this space who are able to walk the walk. In essence, there's a lot of greenwashing going on. There's a lot of organizations failing to act for different reasons, but the ones that act with genuine action and can display that are being seen as the green leaders, like Patagonia, and are getting a huge amount of positive press, positive impact as a result. There is a fear by switching bank that perhaps the sponsorship will be impacted. If there's a bank that's also linked to the sponsorship of an event. Now, this, that's an absolutely legitimate fear. Getting sponsorship for a film production or a festival is hard enough, let alone setting sort of red lines around who we're going to accept sponsorship from. But it is possible. It is possible to replace that sponsorship. Sometimes that comes from a multitude of sources rather than just one, so it's slightly more complex. That's one we covered in the UK. But it is possible to do. And it has such a big impact. I mean, if we look at RBC and the level of money of Canadian dollars that they're putting into fossil fuels right now, and then we think, actually, imagine if taking that 5 million or 10 million that's in that bank account out and putting it with a bank like Van City, or a bank that's actively investing in the green economy, well, suddenly it's not just carbon that we're impacting. Suddenly it's increasing biodiversity, decreasing the gender pay gap, increasing diversity. It's a whole swathe of other positive societal impacts that come along with this.
You shared how you started thinking about the future when you and your wife got pregnant with Theo. Some filmmakers characterize any conversation about RBC and banking carbon pollution as problematic. Some say they're happy the money to make their movie, documentary, or series came from somewhere. Some even say that only a few families own the banking system and they can do nothing as business owners or environmentally responsible individuals concerned about their children's future. What is your take on this as a brand new father and a successful business owner?
Well, thank you. My heart goes out to anybody who feels that way, because it is a busy world. There's so much going on. We've got our jobs to run, kids to look after, have to put food on the table. I really hear it. And we've held over 350 hours of interviews now of all sorts of people. I distill the feelings that we hear consistently as a sense of green fog, FOG, frustration, overwhelm, guilt. So there's a sense of frustration of, why should it be me? Why should I change when my competitor, my neighbor isn't changing. Also frustration at politicians for not playing their part. Frustration at big business for not playing that part. And that holds us back from taking action. There's also this sense of overwhelm. You know, even I did have the time and my kids let me just 10 minutes, you know, free to do a bit of research. It's overwhelming. There's so much greenwashing going on. There's so many options in terms of what we can do. It's just overwhelming. We don't, you know, almost subconsciously, our brains don't necessarily want to pick it up and look at it. And I get it. It's also, you know, quite a boring task, not one of the most sexy tasks in the world, looking at your bank. I get it. And then the third piece is that G of fog, guilt. And it can feel really, I feel this, and I definitely felt it more before I started MotherTree, is this sense of not being green enough, of not doing enough with my time. And that's a guilty feeling. That's a heavy, heavy feeling. And we see this time and time again, this variation. And I think, José Luis, perhaps subconsciously, when somebody says, you know, this is too hard to do, and just need the funding coming in, these feelings are there. The funding is, believe it or not, it sounds quite sensationalist, but the funding is there, even if it doesn't have to come from a fossil fuel company or a bank. And we've seen that in the UK with huge museums who were tied to fossil fuel companies and banks, and we're seeing that worldwide in terms of the arts. So it is possible, but I really understand it is a very hard balance to strike.
So I'm really hoping that there are motion picture financiers out there in the audience, and they can start wrapping their heads around how can they start switching to green financing of productions. Maybe you already said this, but how did you combat greenwashing, art washing, film washing, docu washing, and know the truth about how a bank is investing their funds, and maybe even about green bonds? What is there a benefit to that for film productions specifically?
Yeah, I'll start from the top. A few questions in there. The first one, in terms of how do we combat greenwashing? Well, we've built a system at MotherTree that can understand where banks are investing at a far deeper level than the banks are willing to disclose. So what our system does is we look at what the bank discloses as a starting point. Typically, they're getting quite good at disclosing their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is the emissions from their branches, their physical offices, and the banks that you can actually step into, and the emissions from their technology. It's kind of scope 1, 2, plus their employees. It's kind of a rough approximation of what scope 1 and 2 would be. And they're getting quite good at reporting on that. Well, we feed that into the model. But what they're not good at reporting on is where they invest. And that is the biggest chunk of their emissions. It's also the biggest chunk of their scope 3 emissions. But what we've built, and we tap into trading platforms, into bond issuing platforms, so we can understand where banks are actually lending money down to the specific products. And then we've built through a team of 60 researchers and AI specialists, a team who can get onto the ground and see exactly what these companies are actually doing. So where the bank is investing in a specific company, we are able to really go into detail in terms of what is that actually doing in terms of the money that's going there. So that's how we started to combat greenwashing. What it means is we're able to produce a much clearer picture, not a definitive picture, but a clearer picture of what the banks are actually doing in terms of the money that they're responsible for. In terms of green bonds, it's typically issued for projects that have a positive environmental or climate benefit. So it'll be tied, the bond will be issued tied to a specific outcome in terms of, you know, improving the environment or decreasing carbon emissions as a rough proxy. That's typically what a green bond is. Yeah.
Well, I hope that helps. We are running out of time, so let me ask you a last question, but I'm going to give a little bit of a preamble to my question. Banks divesting, you mentioned that banks divesting billions from dirty energy are a better solution, or the best solution would be. The Canadian banking system is getting pressure from some MPs in the current government to move towards sustainable climate finance. Mary Robinson, you may be familiar with her. She is a neighbor of yours in the UK. She is the first woman president of Ireland and a member of the Elders, which was founded by Nelson Mandela. The Elders is a group of global leaders working for a sustainable planet. She is in direct contact, in conversation with RBC about its financing of the climate crisis. The world is committed to many goals by 2030, many climate goals by 2030. And the motion picture industry is constantly developing and changing how it operates. To end the conversation, in up to 2 minutes, can you tell us what your big picture is about filmmakers and movie companies helping to change the banking system in the next 5 years?
Great challenge, Jose Luis. Start the clock. I think for filmmakers, for people in the film industry, this could be one of the biggest impacts they make is by taking a stand on the financing that they're willing to accept and the banks that they're willing to work with. You know, telling the stories of this crisis, of the biggest challenge that humanity's ever faced, is so important. It becomes increasingly important. So for motion picture executives and employees to tell that story through film, through theatre, through TV series, it's so important. And let's make sure that the money, that the financing backs that up, that actually supports telling the story that we can get to a better place. We don't have to accept this default Armageddon future that we're on, and we are on a route to that. We can change it. We've faced challenges in the past. We got to the moon in 7 years. We did something that was impossible in 1963, and we made it happen by 1969. We can move at that pace. We can move even quicker. We know so much more now than we did in the 60s, and we can do it for something that has an immense benefit to humanity and the planet around us. And I think that's worth fighting for. That's worth taking action. That's worth spending an extra 10 minutes a day to make happen. It's not a big change to move the money, but it is a huge change in terms of what that money does.
Thank you very much, Dan. I also want to thank Melanie and Tina and the Sustainable Entertainment Society for this opportunity. Thank you very much. Any more questions, by the way? Any final questions from anybody?
Hey, Jose Luis and Dan, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us this morning. I think this is a very complicated and complex part of what we're trying to do in terms of green financing. There continues to be growth in this area, and people are really thinking and being thoughtful about where their money is. And also they do, as you say, try to strike that balance with making the darn show to begin with. And, you know, anybody who's an on the ground producer, and I've been there, this is not easy. And, you know, up until the very last second of like your shooting and your star showed up and, you know, the script pages are in, and we're always wondering, is it going to fall apart? And we all know that to make a movie is incredibly difficult. To make a great movie or TV show is nigh impossible. So I think this is an important conversation because I feel like we have a kaleidoscope of opportunities. And we can look at all of them and go, which is the one that I can address with this production? And for example, I think that thinking about where you put your money, if you're a small production, that may actually be something you could do quite quickly. Because in fact, you might be moving, you might not have the same kind of holdings that a larger studio has, that has a lot more loops they need to jump through or hoops they need to jump through. So it seems to me like this is just one more tool that is in our arsenal as we're going, okay, we're making these movies, we're making these television shows. What can we try? What are the interesting opportunities? What small thing can I do? What big thing can I do? So I really appreciate that you're bringing this forward. And it is kind of shocking how much more it doubles. The fact that it more than doubles the carbon footprint on an individual level. So even still, it's something that we can all take away as people, you know, as we're making changes and thinking about our future. Was there anything else? We have like maybe 1 more minute left. Were there any final thoughts that we wanted to leave people off with before we send them on their day?
Well, I'd just like to say a really big thank you to Melanie for the opportunity, and Jose Luis for sharing the Q&A with you, and to the listeners. Thank you so much for listening. And if you felt a sense of you want to take action, or you have a question from what you've heard, then do get in touch. It's Dan Sherrard-Smith. I think I'm the only one on LinkedIn, or dan@mymothertree.com. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
We'll definitely send an email out to everybody. We will share some resources, and also we will share the recording. So more coming at you so that you can take a look and take a bit of a deeper dive in what Dan shared with us today. So I wish you all a wonderful day, and may it be filled with light and positivity. Thank you so much, Dan and Jose Luis, and thank you to the team on the back end. Have a wonderful day, everybody.